Hello and welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are diving into the strange new world of Dune. Now, um, I do want to point out that we're going to do a review of Dune parts 1 and 2, but for content purposes, I'll be splitting them up into 2 episodes, and then at a later date, I'll be uploading the complete episode of a review of both parts 1 and 2. Um, Now, this was a pretty interesting movie that we saw, and uh, the first Dune came out in what, 2021,
Yep,
Lee?
2021.
Okay, yeah, because it came out during right around the height of the pandemic, and then we did a trailer reaction for Dune Part 2 last year, and we thought it was going to come to cinemas in November of 2023, but that got pushed because of the strike. And we saw Part 2 yesterday. But before we did, I have to admit I never saw Dune Part 1, so I had an incentive to watch it, and it was quite an interesting movie. This was directed by Canadian director Denis Villeneuve, and
Great
and
director.
yeah, and can I say I thought it was a pretty good idea to split it up into parts 1 and 2, just because even though the novel may seem pretty light reading, and I'm saying light in air quotes, there's a lot of material to cover, and it's pretty dense,
Yes.
so it's not so I think if they had tried to stuff everything into a 2 hour long or a 3 hour long movie, it would just overwhelm everybody, right?
Yep.
Um,
We've gotten Dune, the one that came out, and I want to say it was 84, I think.
yeah,
So that
84, and then there
would
was
have
the
been what
2001
we got
miniseries.
was that version. So
Well, don't forget the miniseries that came out in 2001
yes,
also.
correct. Yes, there's the miniseries, absolutely.
But even then, I kind of felt like they made a few sacrifices here and there. So I think, and this is just me being biased here. I just think the Villeneuve version kind of matches the vision that Frank Herbert had when he wrote the novel back in '65. But let's go ahead and dive in. So Lee, you were the first to actually uh, watch this movie. What were your impressions? What did you think of the whole
Yeah,
universe?
yeah. So, and I'm glad you phrased it like that, right? Because I think that is really important. That this
It,
is
I mean, it literally is a universe if you think about it.
yes, yeah, absolutely right, and it is very dense, right? This is a I love that you said that because I think it's really important for people that are trying to get into this that it absolutely is probably something that like having more than one watch and just be able to kind of absorb all the information, absorb all the terminology. The places like all that stuff is going to be really important. So, I think for anyone that maybe saw like the first one, it absolutely is a great rewatch because I think there's just so much information. It's good to be able to absorb it in kind of multiple viewings because we do see like a lot of that stuff. And there's a kind of a lot of competing discussions as far as like what sort of things you want to be able to talk about in Dune,
And there's just so
because
many
there is just so much out there.
And I was gonna say, because there's so many themes you could touch on. Because I mean, I remember a few weeks ago, you mentioned that the Bene Gesserit might be a good topic to talk about, but then, in a group text with one of our good friends, he made a mention that the patriarch Leto, Atreides, he kind of suffered the same fate as Ned Stark. So you could sort of go into the whole comparison with Game of Thrones, because there's a lot of parallels between that and the series. Um,
Yes,
I
and
mean,
I think for
it's
yeah,
so medieval if you think about it. It's like Game of Thrones, but in space, because it has such a dark medieval atmosphere to it that you almost forget that it's set in was it 10,000,
yes,
8,000
yeah,
years in the future.
hmm yeah, absolutely, and I think probably Game of Thrones, not to throw that comparison around very lightly, but I think it's probably something that's people are probably the most familiar with. You will see kind of that overlapping interest because you kind of have this like Imperium, which is kind of the overarching empire, and you have these very big houses that kind of create the world that we're going to dive into. And I think the movie does a great job of helping build that up, because we start out on the home planet of House Atreides, where we kind of get to meet all of our critical characters, right? So you got Duke Leto, that's played very, very well by Oscar Isaacs. And honestly, I think the whole cast did a great job. You got Lady Jessica, who's played by Rebecca Ferguson. And Lady Jessica is a part of the Bene Gesserit, which I think we'll probably touch a little bit in a little while, but
Mhm.
that's going to be a very important thing throughout. And then we meet kind of our main character, right, Paul Atreides. And I just love how this movie does such a good job of helping set the foundation for what we're going to see. Um, and I see that in a lot of ways, right? So you get to meet Paul, and I like how when you get to meet Paul, you see a bunch of things that carry over throughout the movie, right? So one, we know that he's a strong fighter. We see that he trains with a character called Gurney Halleck, and he also befriends another person that's a strong fighter in Duncan Idaho. So you kind of have these two characters, and they're clearly setting the foundation that our guy Paul, right? He's not a slouch, right? He's not going to be someone that goes out there is easily beaten up, right? Like he's been training for years to kind of be the successor for House of Trades. The other thing I really like too that I think does a great job of kind of showing what he's all about is you see him like watching kind of these video lectures, and the video lectures are there, and it's kind of helping him understand more about the world. And as he moves forward and goes to Arrakis, you see how he's able to kind of learn about what it's like to live there. So I loved how they built that up. Like they want to help show that this Paul character, like he's not going to just be out there, screwing up, not having any clue about the world, not be able to defend himself. They really built that up at the very beginning, and I really enjoyed that.
Right, because even though
Once you
he's a
kind of
even though he's a fish out of water, I mean, he's not a completely hopeless moron. Like he knows
exactly,
what to do. I mean, it's book
exactly.
learning. It's book learning, but it's somewhere to to go from.
Exactly, right. It's a start. And I think that's what they needed, because, I think we see a lot of times with movies where characters just start doing stuff and there's never any understanding of how they could do something like that. I think, not to bring up Damsel, which I know uh, you kind of watched, and eventually I did come around to watch. Like, there's just times where it, the foundation for what she's able to do is not really made plain to people. Yet,
Right.
right? They make it very obvious that Paul Atreides absolutely is a fully capable person that's, learning about his, environment that he's going to. He's being trained to be an excellent fighter, which we see happen throughout the movies. And I just really like how they built up Paul at the very beginning. Um, so we have House Atreides, right? And then on the other hand, we have House Harkonnen. And that's kind of our evil group, to put it very lightly. So you have kind of Baron Vladimir, and then you have Rabba, who are kind of the two main figureheads of House Harkonnen, and really kind of the what kind of jettisons us to Arrakis, which is where everything takes place. You see that House Harkonnen has been taken away from Arrakis and has been replaced by House Atreides. Now, unbeknownst to the characters, right, the reasons for this are a little bit underhanded, because really the House Atreides becoming the power in Arrakis is really just a guise for them to get killed off. And I think that's kind of where we kind of get really jump started with the whole story, because we go to Arrakis, and I just absolutely enjoy that world, right? And I believe you made a comparison to Lawrence of Arabia, right? Um, and it absolutely feels like that. Like you feel absolutely immersed in this world where we got these sprawling deserts. And you get to meet like some of the really critical parts of this, right? So you got the spice, right? That's the main. I would say it's the kind of like the unobtainium of this series. Is you have this spice. This spice is the single most valuable resource in the world. It's used for lots of different things, mainly for space travel being the most prominent one. And because of it, Arrakis is a huge place that people want to be at because that spice is just so valuable.
Isn't it
And
isn't Arrakis the only source for the spice?
yes, yes, absolutely. That's a great call out. And yes,
Okay.
Arrakis, during this time frame is the only place that spice can be mined. So that just kind of further creates this idea about how important Arrakis is to everything. Um, so we have Arrakis, and like I said, we have House Atreides ends up going there. And we kind of see Paul, he just kind of continues with being able to learn in the area, and then we start to see some of the other pieces come in, right? So I think this is a great time to talk about the Bene Gesserit, which I don't think you could really go too far without discussing them. The Bene Gesserit is such an interesting inclusion to this universe, right? So the Bene Gesserit kind of have a lot of things going on. So I look at them as kind of this religious sect. And even though I think the Bene Gesserit kind of say they're not religious, I think it's hard to kind of ignore that. But you pretty much have the Bene Gesserit who are there, and they're really there to, how would I put this?
They kind of embed themselves in the beds of noble houses.
Yes, that's true, right? So they do literally um, do it like that, right? And they have kind of the ear of the emperor, right? So I think it's a faction that's kind of very much ingrained into this whole universe because what they do is they're really there to kind of help create their version of this kind of strong being, right? That's kind of what they're there for. Something called, I believe it's pronounced, and I apologize if I butcher this, the Kwisatz Haderach, right? That's kind of their one, and that's what they're ultimately trying to do. So what the Bene Gesserit do is, they have kind of this very long-standing, kind of, I guess, genetic breeding that they're doing, where they're trying to help get really important traits to kind of create this special being who's going to be a male. So all the Bene Gesserit are females. Their, kind of their ultimate goal is to have a strong male that ends up becoming kind of this prophet. And we kind of see how the Bene Gesserit are playing in this. So we see how they're kind of the one that's whispering in the Emperor's ear about, hey, you need to bring apart the fall of House Atreides. We even see Lady Jessica, who is a Bene Gesserit. She has a clear relationship with her husband Leto, but even for her, she is just a character that um, has her own idea of what she wants to do. So even though she's a part of this kind of like religious sect, ultimately she still kind of has her free will where she's able to do what she wants to do. And we see how the Bene Gesserit, they've really had this impact in Arrakis, right? So we have the Fremen being the indigenous people that are all on Arrakis. So the Bene Gesserit have kind of come in, and they've kind of spread the word of the Bene Gesserit, right? They're pretty much just explaining like, hey, there's going to be this prophet that comes in. They use the term the Lisan al Gaib, and that ends up being kind of this prophet that they're all expecting to come in, and that's really spread by the Bene Gesserit. So I really enjoy how we have this kind of religious faction, and we can kind of see how this religious faction is perverting the world, right? They're doing all this stuff for their own means, and so many people are brought up in it from the emperor on down. So I absolutely love that rendition. I thought that was super good. Did you have anything to chime in with the Bene Gesserit just to make sure I covered everything as far as what they're about?
I mean, they kind of. I mean, if you think about it, you know how like in the real world people say, oh, the Illuminati are controlling everything behind the scenes. We just don't know about it. It's kind of like if someone took the Illuminati rumor and like dialed it up to 11, right? And to reinforce that fact, the Illuminati basically decide, well, the best way to manipulate events to our favor is to kind of get into bed literally with the most powerful people in the universe and kind of steer them you know to where we want to go. So they kind of take that maxim, make love not war, and kind of just twist it on its head. But it's just so fascinating at how at how much influence they exert on everybody. Um, because you kind of get this feeling that everybody is afraid of them.
Yes,
Like
absolutely.
because even when because even when the Reverend Mother talks to Vladimir Harkonnen, you can sort of tell he's like, yeah, I'm not gonna fuck with these people. I mean, I mean, because someone like Vladimir Harkonnen, who could give two shits about honor and is basically backstabbing everybody he meets, even he knows he's not going to double cross these people. You know?
Yep, and I think that, like I said, the fact that they have kind of some of these powers, I think, kind of helps in grading that too, right? Because I think there's a definite fear for that because for the Bene Gesserit, right, they do have these kind of visions, right? And we see Paul starts to have some of them himself, but they absolutely have these visions where they're able to see glimpses of the future. They also have something that's referred to as the voice, which is this ability to kind of influence people. So they are, even though they're kind of this, like I said, religious sect, they do have very clear powers that I think definitely kind of puts them into a boat of there's probably a very good reason that people fear them because they do have this power. So, but yeah, absolutely. It is, like I said, a very interesting take on, kind of creating these people that, in essence, have um, powers in this world. So it is a very interesting thing. Um, so I would say on Arrakis, we kind of get all this kind of like dumped on our plate, and we kind of slowly start to see, how I think how good of a leader Duke Leto is, right? I think obviously Harkonnens not very likable people, and this is a very much a polar opposite to have Leto be in this world. And we see that he's someone that is very much of honor, like he wants things to be fair. He focuses on his people, like he's someone that I think everyone wants a good leader to be. Very much to the tone of Ned Stark.
Yeah, I was
Pretty
gonna
much,
I was gonna
right?
say like I mean, and I even said in the group text, I was like, the Harkonnens, they do give off this Lannister vibe about them.
Yes,
You know?
yes, it absolutely is. It's hard to totally avoid that comparison because it absolutely has some credence in this. So we start to see House Atreides and the Fremen really trying to help build this actual positive relationship. But unfortunately, it comes to a very quick halt because we have House Harkonnen comes in, and they end up pretty much wiping out all of House Atreides in a single night. It is a total one-sided event. I do think it's a little bit weird. I know they try to explain that, like, oh, we got rid of we brought down the defenses and everything like that, but it's kind of hard to imagine you have all these ships coming to this area and nobody picks up on it until it's too late. That was one thing that kind of was a little bit distracting to me. But regardless, pretty much House Atreides gets wiped off the map very, very quickly. Um, uh, the Duke ends up getting captured, and fortunately, Paul and Lady Jessica end up being able to escape. They were being taken to their death in essence, but they were able to kind of break through and escape. And this is, I think, where the Ned Stark comparison will continue, is that we have um, Duke Leto, and pretty much he decides that he's going to do his best to go out with a bang. So he has like this tooth, right? That has this. I don't know if they ever explain it, but it's
It's a
some
capsule,
type of
basically.
airborne. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Would you say?
No, I was gonna say, like, basically, Doctor Yue tells him it's a capsule. He just has to bite down on it,
Correct.
and
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's like some type of airborne thing that kills people in close proximity, right? So, this is where unfortunately, Duke Leto dies, and he's able to take out the room that actually has the Baron from House Harkonnen involved with it, and pretty much he's able to unfortunately not kill him, but ends up severely damaging him, and something where he needs kind of like constant care moving forward, because he was able to kind of inflict this kind of grievous injury on him.
yeah, because he's got to take some
Um,
weird mud bath, doesn't he?
yes, yeah, he goes into like weird tar stuff. It's I don't think ever really explained. And he that's kind of what we do. We see him throughout this movie and the next movie, still needing to do that. I'm assuming probably on a daily basis, if not more. So, obviously leaves a very lasting impact on him. And this is where we have kind of Paul and Jessica trying to survive out in the desert, where we kind of finally get to meet the Fremen. So we've kind of met them briefly. We met Stilgar, who's a leader of one of the various, like, there's a lot of different sects for the Fremen.
Yeah,
So Stilgar being one of the leaders of one of the ones that's close to where they land. Um, and we also get to meet Shawnee, right? And Shawnee is someone that Paul has been having visions about. So I thought it was very, when we finally get to meet her, it's like, oh yeah, like I'm sure that must be very jarring for your character to finally meet this person he's been dreaming about for quite some time. So we finally get to meet the Fremen. Obviously, people, even within the Fremen, have very different ideas about what they need to do. And this is where we start to kind of see more of that religious aspect play up, because Stilgar, who's the kind of the leader that we meet, he's very much believes in this idea of the Lisan al Gaib. Once again, that being the kind of prophet that's going to, kind of bring them to paradise. So you have kind of this, belief in that, whereas other people, even within this group of Fremen that we follow, um, believe that that's all a bunch of crap, right? And they believe and they look at both Paul and Jessica as being pretty much spies. Um, so our kind of first movie ends with Paul gets into a fight, and it was with Jamis. Is that the name? Am I remembering that right?
yeah. I mean, what's weird is that during that period where he's trying to survive out in the desert, like he keeps getting visions of Jamis, and you would think that Jamis, when he meets him, he's like, oh, I'm this wise sage, I know of you, but but in fact, he's really really hostile to the tribe accepting Paul and Jessica
Yes.
into the
He's
group.
very much the opposite of what you
I,
would probably be thinking of.
I'll be honest with you, I kind of like that because because it kind of curbs your expectation because you're thinking, oh, he of all people, all people in the Fremen would know who Paul is and acknowledge him, but no, he's just like, no, I don't want this guy in here. And you would think Paul would say something to kind of counter that, but he doesn't say anything, which is a bit odd. But
Yes. Yeah. And to me, the most surprising thing is, so they end up having this fight, right? So pretty much, they have kind of this kind of breakdown where Jamis is like, no, like, I don't like these people, I don't trust them. I want to fight these people, and pretty much Jamis and Paul have this fight to the death. Paul kind of shows once again, right, his strong fighting technique that he's learned over the years. So you see him kind of not toying with him per se, but he's very reluctant to kill him because this is, he's never killed a guy before. So Jamis ends up being killed, and this is Paul's first kill, right? First of unfortunately many, as we'll see in as we move forward. But this is kind of the original kill, and that to me is what makes Jamis's character so jarring to me because, well, like you pointed out, it's interesting that we're expecting this Jamis to be a more critical character, a character that plays, maybe a stronger role in Paul's kind of getting into power. But he ends up just kind of being a character that gets killed within a few minutes of us meeting him. So it is very interesting how they kind of play on that idea that these visions, while they're there to help be like prophetic and help see the future, kind of the purpose or how critical they are very much depends on case by case. And that's kind of where I think our first movie ends, where unfortunately we got House Atreides totally defeated. You have Paul and Lady Jessica kind of out in the fringes, and we're finally be able to meet the Fremen, who are kind of this kind of all different people with different beliefs, and they're all kind of in different areas. So we finally get a chance to meet them, and like I said, it is, to me, I thought the first one, it needed to end somewhere. It just felt like the end was, I guess, very odd to me. I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's like one of those things where you get to, I don't know. I don't know. How do you feel about the ending for the first movie, right? Where it kind of just ended on this kind of fight with Jamis and then just kind of continuing to go to like kind of this Fremen stronghold.
I mean, in one sense, I can sort of understand why they ended it that way because because it does show Paul, at least in the initial stages of trying to start or initiate what what his father wanted to do, was to create an alliance with the Fremen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I feel like you get to this apex where where everybody in House Atreides and their retainers are massacred, and then the desert portion's kind of like that drop off point, and it's like, well, where else can you go from here? Because and you mentioned this before, Jamis is kind of is kind of built up as, or at least the visions of Jamis they're kind of built up as like this expectation of, oh, this is going to be leads to the next step, and it kind of just ends abruptly with Jamis being killed, and you're like, well, that was a huge letdown in a way. Now, and this is just me spitballing here. Do you think the movie would have, part one would have been better had it ended with, um, you know, Paul and just Lady Jessica trying to escape and they get captured, and then we're kind of left with a sort of, you know, apprehension of what's going to happen to them. Do you think that would have made a better ending?
Probably, probably. I think I would have liked that a bit more because I think kind of the unfortunate thing with this, and like I said, there's with how much you have to kind of put into these movies, I just don't know. You could kind of pick and choose where you want to leave it, but to me, that would have been, I think, more interesting because I feel like you have this really big battle, right? So when you're kind of like just out in the desert and you're just kind of having this kind of small interaction, it does make it a little bit more challenging to find like a really good time to stop. So I think it's one of those things where it's like you had this big climax and you kind of end it as it's tailing off. And, not probably a lot of different ways that you can look at it. Maybe it's, kind of deals more with, um, like you pointed out, like maybe they escape, and then as their ship is crashing, like maybe the Fremen show up, and there's like kind of this altercation where you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Maybe that makes more sense. Maybe Jamis is the one that ends up capturing them, and you kind of leave it on that note. Obviously, if you do it like that, then this movie starts off the second movie where you have this fight with Jamis, and it becomes very anticlimactic. So I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you can look at that, but yeah, I think probably would have liked to have seen the ending just be in a different spot because you have this huge massacre that happens, and it kind of ends with this one-on-one fight with Jamis, and that's kind of how it ends with them kind of marching off into the desert. So yeah, like I said, I think for the first one, I just loved how much role we get to see. They absolutely know how to handle that. We got to meet the critical houses. We get to meet, we get to learn more about Arrakis, which is where everything kind of happens. Get to learn more and more about the Fremen. So you have kind of all these things that the first one really helps build up for, and I think they do a fantastic job at that. It's so easy, I think, to get sucked into the Dune universe. And certainly, if you do watch the first one, there's loads of great material that's out there for you to understand and to learn more about the world that they're in.
I mean, I will say this. I mean, for an epic movie, it kind of has a really really small cast of characters when you think about it.
Yeah, that's
And
great
and
point. Yeah,
yeah, and that's what I enjoy because it's like it's easy to keep tabs on who's who because you know for the most part, most of the insignificant characters they kind of play their bit and they kind of just tail off. Like Duncan Idaho, for instance. I mean, as as sad as it was to see him go, I mean he played his part and there was no other role he could play. Um,
yeah,
so so I think that kind of worked to their advantage because how many times have we seen like these big epic movies where where you have all these characters and you're like, okay, so I think I know who the core characters are, but what are the other characters in the periphery doing? Um, and the big offender here would be the Star Wars franchise because you have so many of these characters just like popping, popping in and out, and you're like, or I know this guy and I know this guy, but what the hell does that character do? I'm not quite sure what role they play, and when they do play that role, you're like, oh, okay, so it's not as big as we thought it was. But here it's like you have a small cast of characters, you know who everybody is, and they play their role perfectly, and they play it up to a point, and then they kind of, to use theater lingo, they exit stage left, and that's it. You know, they contribute to their part as appropriately. But what would you give? What score would you give for Dune Part One?
yeah. So I would say for Dune Part One, I thought I was a solid 4.2 spices out of 5. I think they did a great job. I don't, and I guess one thing definitely should talk about is the worms, right?
Yeah.
Worms, super cool. We get to see them a little bit. They're kind of the big predator in the desert. But yeah, it is like I said, really cool to see them. And like I said, I think yeah, I gave it a solid 4.2. I thought it was good. I thought it set the foundation for a lot of things. I could certainly understand that for people that are maybe more action oriented. I would say yes, they definitely do have some of that, but it's definitely not until the latter half. So I can understand some people might be turned off by that, but I think if you are looking for kind of like a true epic where you're really getting a chance to be a part of this world, the first movie does a very, very good job of that. It certainly got me very excited for the second one, which we saw yesterday.
Yep. So I'll give it 4.3 spices. And I will say this, I mean this is a pretty big universe. There's just so much information packed into it. I mean, I had to go into Wikipedia and look up all these things because it's like y- there's just so many different moving parts into it. You've got the Bene Gesserit, you've got the Space Guild, you've got all these different houses, you've got the the Emperor Shaddam the Fourth of the Imperium. I mean, there's just so much going on, and I think what Dennis Villeneuve did was find a way to make it. He made it palatable to both the diehard fans who have been devoted to this franchise for years, but also giving newcomers a taste of what this universe is all about. Um, and and I think for his part, he managed to please both crowds because the hardcore fans can say I'm pretty satisfied with what he's done. He's pretty much been faithful for the most part to the books, and the newcomers can say, wow, this is some pretty exciting shit here. I can definitely roll with it. Um, my only complaint here, and this might actually extend to to Frank Herbert, but I kind of feel like with House Harkonnen, because we see this happen quite a lot. I mean, we know who the villain is, right? It's like they look, they act, they speak in a way where you're like, yep, this guy is sus as hell. We better put a red alert on him. Um, and House Harkonnen is no different because I mean the way they look, it's like yeah, these are like some pretty menacing dudes, as
Yes.
opposed to the treaty. As opposed to the treaties, you're like, oh, these guys are like the nicest people you've ever met. I could see them bringing like a nice plate of pie to their new neighbors down the street, right? Um, so that would be my only my major, well, not my only complaint, but my major complaint would be House Harkonnen could kind of be a bit more I guess fleshed out as characters because they
Yes.
kind of because I mean like I said, how many times have we said this in all the reviews that we've done when we talk about villains, right? It's just it's just so easy to make the protagonist good, but it's so hard to make the antagonist kind of relatable, right?
Yeah. It's
But
they're very much black and white, good versus evil.
I mean,
The
literally,
Atreides and Harkonnen.
literally, when we go into part two, I mean, their home world is where everything is literally in black and white.
Yes.
So it's like it's and I was gonna say too because they kind of look like Nosferatu, like it's like the whole family just looks like they're vampires, really. So I mean, so there's no other way to kind of like portray them as evil than to make them look like the most evil character you can think of in film. But for but that aside, I mean, I think the acting was phenomenal. I mean, can I just say the special effects were amazing. And and the filming locations, the way that they filmed it, like Caladan, the planet of the home planet of House Atreides, that ocean world. Oh my god, it looks so beautiful. And then you contrast it with Arrakis. It's like it's just I mean, everything about it is just amazing. Like I mean, we can go on for hours and hours just talking about just the aesthetics of it, but it's one of those movies where it works on so many levels. It works very well aesthetically. I mean, the music. I mean, don't forget the music score was phenomenal as well. I don't know if you mentioned that as well. Obviously, the acting is definitely sets the bar. Story writing for the most part is great. So I mean, I would
Is
definitely
it done by
recommend.
Hans Zimmer, right? Fantastic composer.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for the most part, this is one of those movies that I will definitely watch again. Even if I'm not watching it to kind of like learn more about the universe, just to watch it because it's such a wonderful piece of work. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if years from now they put this in the what's that list that they have, the congressional like list of
Yes,
like
I know what you're
historical
referring to.
films.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I could definitely see that making the list at some point in the next few decades or so. All right, so that's going to do it for our review of Dune Part One, and just let us know down in the comments below what you think, and we'll catch you on the next one. All right, and welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are going to dive into Dune Part Two, and this is a movie that we saw yesterday, Lee. Now, now for Dune Part One, we did have the benefit of of watching it and rewatching it to kind of absorb the information here, but seeing in theaters, as great of an experience as it is, there's just so much information to absorb. Even when the pacing is pretty slow, I I mean, you're still having to absorb so much information. Now, I mentioned this to you yesterday in theaters, but the first half really does give this Lawrence of Arabia vibe to it. It's like I mean, you have these like dramatic shots of the desert landscape, and then you have Paul Atreides, um, who's pretty much, and I mean, he's pretty much is Lawrence of Arabia because he's fighting alongside the Fremen against House Harkonnen, who have since reclaimed their stewardship of Arrakis. So for the first, well, I mean, what can we say, like 45 to 60 minutes of the film, it's Paul basically, coming to terms with his identity as a member of the Fremen, as well as trying to retain his identity as the next Duke Atreides. But what were your thoughts on part two? After seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought part two was a great continuation, right? I think it does a really good job of helping kind of see that shift, right? So we kind of deal with the first one where we see, House Atreides totally gets, kind of destroyed overnight. And we see the Harkonnen kind of come into the power. And then we start to see how, Paul really kind of takes this ragtag group of rebels, so to speak. And we start to see him, becoming kind of this stronger leader, right? And it's funny because in the first one, he talks about how, he doesn't want to be a leader. That's not what it's about. And then his father was like, it's funny you should say that because really to be a good leader, it's someone that doesn't actually actively look for leadership. And it's funny how true that becomes because he pretty much does everything he can to avoid kind of this prophecy or for him to kind of fulfill his role as being this leader. And he does everything he can to not do it. But eventually the pieces kind of fall into place and that's what ends up happening. So I think they, like I said, do a great job of showing how, he starts to really get this kind of strong relationship with the Fremen where they start to view him as like, okay, now he's a strong fighter. He's starting to do all the stuff that we're expecting this prophet to be able to do. And we sort of see how all that builds up to kind of this climax of him kind of taking kind of that ultimate leadership role.
Well, I mean, let's also keep in mind too the Bene Gesserit, play a much more prominent role in part two than they did in part one, right? Because we begin to see what their motivations are being fleshed out, all the more, right? Because because we come to find out that it was the Bene Gesserit who kind of put the word in the Emperor's ear that hey, maybe House Atreides, maybe we shouldn't trust them too much, so let's go ahead and set them up to fail. And they kind of kind of like string him along to where he makes that deal with House Harkonnen to basically carry out the events that we saw in part one. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it becomes obviously a lot more apparent in the second one how much pull the Bene Gesserit has, right? And we start to see kind of their power, right? So you have Lady Jessica that's there, she's, pregnant with a daughter who converses a lot during this. I do find that very interesting that we
Yeah,
suddenly have
yeah,
this not even a child, right? This unborn baby that plays really kind of a critical role. So we see, we see Lady Jessica. She drinks the water of life, and she becomes a Reverend Mother, which is kind of the one of the highest, if not the highest, kind of in the whole, I guess, hierarchy of the Bene Gesserit.
so
So
let me
she becomes this
so let me ask you this: do you kind of get the feeling that every planet has a Reverend Mother, or if there's just
yes,
like
yes.
okay,
Yeah, I would say not only every planet has a Reverend Mother, but it seems like just depending on like it's just kind of that like religious leader, right? So I guess like if you have a church that's in your area,
it's like a bishop
that
basically.
yeah, exactly. Like
Okay.
he's kind of the closest thing that you have. So there's probably some people over it, but that's who you have in your area, so to speak. So, but yeah, we do have this Reverend Mother, and as I said, like she's kind of you start to see for Jessica, right? She starts to play a much more integral role in Paul coming to power.
Yeah,
And
because
I do
she
have to admit, this is
Yeah, because she's
yeah,
going around actually spreading the word about Paul. Because
yes,
and that's what I find so funny is the fact that here's Paul up in the north. He's like, yeah, I'm not this guy you keep going on about. I mean, I don't know who you're talking about. I just want to be a Fremen. I just want to hang out with you guys. And Lady Jessica's like pushing him along. She's like, no, you have to fulfill your destiny. This is who you are. And she's going around and she's basically going around whipping up the all the tribes up north, and then she goes down south to basically spread the word just so everybody can come to accept him for for being the quote unquote messiah of the Fremen. But but a part of me kind of has to wonder, like, is like like, is she sort of like manipulating him subconsciously to accept it, or is it something that he kind of is forced into because of the circumstances that she creates?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would absolutely say it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, because I do find how, like, it feels like they have an extremely close relationship in the first one, but it starts to feel like that relationship becomes strained. I definitely felt like in the second one where they have a much more strained relationship, because for her, right, she's doing this because she really wants Paul to believe who he is and is trying to get him to, not be fearful of what he's going to become. But in that same token, I think that starts to create more of this disconnect, because for Paul, this is not something that he wants, but it feels like Jessica's almost forcing it upon him that, like, hey, look, this is your reality. Like, you don't have to accept it. Or excuse me, it might not be the reality that you want, but you have to accept that this is what's going to happen.
And can I
So
just preface too? I mean, I mean, he's having these repeated dreams of billions. Did you say billions or millions dying because of a holy war in his name?
yes, yeah, absolutely, and I do believe it was B's and billions.
Okay, gotcha.
So it is a huge thing. So yeah, there is obviously a lot of kind of turmoil there, and they're all looking for this idea of something called the golden path, right? This kind of one reality where things just work out really well. And I think for a lot of us, it's very hard to really grasp that idea, right? It's kind of like, I guess, to use a similar idea, it's the idea of in Infinity War, where Doctor Strange is like, yes, there's a lot of paths where everything dies, but there's one path where everything works out, or at least the ultimate goal works out. But unfortunately, there's sacrifices along the way. This is very much in that same breath, where Paul kind of eventually gets these powers, where he's able to start to see the future a lot more clearly than he's seen previously, and because of that, he understands what he needs to do. It's just that unfortunately, what he needs to do um, is not always the greatest thing for anybody, right? Either for him, for his relationship with Shawnee. Like, there's so many things that he has to do because he sees the ultimate goal, but we as the audience, we don't really understand. We start to not fully grasp his motivation, but I think that's just because he has all this power now, that what he sees is ultimately what he's aiming for.
I mean, we'll also keep in mind too, because because what happens at the end of part one kind of sets the stage for what we see in part two. Because before, Paul is pretty much this, I guess, naive, would be a good word. He's sort of like this young
Yeah.
naive ingenue who's like, most of what he learns comes from books, or film books, I should say. And and most of his fighting skills are pretty much done in sort of like a staged area, right? So so for the most part, he's lived a pretty sheltered life. So being thrust into the wilderness, um, as a warrior, taking his first life when he kills Jamis, and then slowly rising through the ranks of the Fremen to kind of become one of them, and leading these raids on the Harkonnen, spice operations. It kind of changes him, really, um, and in a way, you kind of get the sense that he understands that this is something that has to happen if he wants to survive. Um, so when he does eventually embrace his destiny, as this, was it Lang Al Gaib, he he comes to a realization that this is the only way to survive. um
Hmm.
he can't just keep hiding out and being a nomad or anything. He has to rise to the top. Now, so this is something that came across my mind as I was watching the movie, because y- because for all the influence and power that Paul has, he is pretty much being influenced by two women. Obviously, his mother, Lady Jessica, who was asking him to fulfill his destiny, and then Chani, who wants him to remain this young, free spirited guy as a Fremen. Um, did that dynamic ever cross your mind as you were watching that
Oh yeah,
movie?
For sure, right? And I think this is where a lot of that pull starts to happen, right? Because you have his mom who is trying to get him set up for this, and really, it's kind of like he's been built up since a very young age that that's what he's about, right? He's gone through all this training, he's done all this stuff where he just wants where everyone's kind of expecting this bigger and grander thing, right? Like if you really think about it, he's got this whole backstory of being this kind of leader of the Bene Gesserit, this male character that's going to kind of take this huge role in their life. And also in doing this, he also has kind of on his father's side, it's him taking over House Atreides, this really strong house that has, kind of like a lot of momentum around them as being such a big thing. So for Paul, like he's kind of always had this like really like kind of prophetic idea that he's going to be something so huge and so great. But really, we see him, he's just okay, being a part of the Fremen, right? Like he's not interested in that role. So I think, Lady Jessica is a side of him that reminds him that he has all this great potential and, he has all this huge things that he has to aspire to. Whereas, Shawnee is just there to be like, hey, you're just a normal person, right? Like you don't have to do all this. Like you can just enjoy what you're doing and be who you are. And I think that that's something that he has kind of a turmoil with is like, do I follow my mom and become this bigger thing, or do I follow Chani and I just get to just be another Fremen and just be able to do what I want to do without kind of leading down this path that has all this bloodshed behind it. So it is something where both these characters I think play kind of you have to kind of side with one or the other, so to speak.
Yeah, because I mean, like in part one, you see that dynamic between Leto and Lady Jessica, because Leto wants him to be, Duke, Paul Atreides, right? The
Mm-hmm.
next in line, whereas his mother wants him to be, more than that. This transcendental figure who, leads the world in a new direction, and that thing kind of continues. Whereas it's just split, two ways, you can sort of see it split as three ways, because it's, does Paul become, this Messiah? Does he become, the next Duke of Atreides, or does he, become this Fremen character who just lives out in the desert? So, so if you think about it, it's kind of split three ways. Like, which way do I go? And you kind of see that conflict. Playing out in his head, because and I was gonna say our good friend Chris, if you're watching, hey buddy, he actually did point out yesterday that the if you think about it, the pacing of the movie, is pretty much spent, with Paul just saying, I don't want to go south, I don't want to go south, I don't want to go south. If you want to go south, go south, and I'm just gonna stay up here in the north. And then when he does go south, everything just kind of like, what was going at like 10 miles per hour just goes to 100 miles per hour. Everything is
Yeah.
just like, just put it into fifth gear and just go right on ahead. What did you think about the pacing and everything?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I agree, and I think ultimately that was always going to kind of be the case, right? Because I think once he takes over that ownership role of, he drinks the water of life, he kind of fully gets the powers of the Bene Gesserit that he's been kind of training for. So eventually, when he gets that, obviously everything changes, and I think that was always going to kind of be the case. It definitely feels like everything goes to 100 really quick. So yeah, I do agree that the pacing could be maybe a little bit more jarring, but ultimately I think it's a way for them to kind of show that transition from being this kind of minor character that's just okay with being behind the scenes, and then he just kind of gets catapulted in this role of like, okay, I got to accept my destiny, like this is what I need to be able to do. So yeah, it definitely can be very jarring with how they look at it.
So once Paul does accept his destiny, like he begins to he begins to show himself as um a much more capable figure, which he sort of was at the beginning of the movie, but but once he drinks the water of life and once he embraces his role, he begins to take on a more active military role in leading the attack. Um,
Yeah.
so obviously the one the one scene that comes to mind is when they discover the was it atomic weapons or nuclear weapons that his great grandfather had buried somewhere.
Yeah, I believe they described it as an atomic stockpile.
Okay, yeah. I mean, when that scene happened, I was like, yeah, he's definitely going to use that, like against
Yes.
the Harkonnens. Um, but and speaking of Harkonnens, we actually did get introduced to do Baron Vladimir's other nephew. Was it Fade Ralpha, played by Austin Butler? And can I just say, like, can I just say we, for the very few moments that we saw him, he did a phenomenal job as that villain.
Agreed.
Um, and also, can I just say the home world of House Harkonnen pretty much just shows just how evil these people are, because everything is literally in black and white, and the way that they appear, it's just, I mean, they look like vampires, dude. Like, it's like, I mean, I was just thinking to myself, I was like, if I was on that planet, I would just be at unease the entire time, because
Hmm.
you really have no idea of who to trust. I mean, it seems like the only stranger on that world who seems to feel at home is that Bene Gesserit lady, played by Leia Seydoux, who ends
Hmm.
up sleeping with Fed Ralpha, and having his kid, or thinks having his kid, um, at the Reverend Mother's direction. What were your thoughts on the whole Harkonnen storyline in part two?
Yeah, and I would say you're absolutely right, and I think that it was very purposeful that it was very black and white because it does feel absolutely jarring. So it definitely takes some time to get used to just kind of seeing the world the way that is. And yes, I do agree that Butler did a great job portraying that character, and I like how they talk so much about like their fighting, but it was interesting that there's kind of this gladiator event that happens, right? With Fade Rafa being kind of the main one, and he's fighting against three people, and actually two of them have been drugged, right? So like these people are going out there very clearly not in top fighting shape. Now, one of them is, but definitely looks like kind of an older one, right? Like the two ones that he kills first are the ones that are drugged, and they feel absolutely like they're the stronger ones. The third guy feels a little bit weak, and I think that just kind of goes to show kind of the kind of the corruption that exists there, right? Like they're having these events, but really the events are there just to kind of just be free kills, right? Like there's not a whole lot of stress there. Now, for the third person that they fight, it ends up, he's not drugged and he's looks like a pretty skilled fighter. So I think it kind of shows that they do have some fighting prowess. But I did find it very interesting that they were drugging people prior to it, which just to show that maybe they're not as talented or as strong as people are led to believe. And really, for me, for the final part, I felt their whole kind of storyline was rather underwhelming. Right, I felt like they played such a critical role in the first one, and the second one, it's like they constantly are being bested by Paul and the Fremen. And I think that's a very stark contrast because we see the first one how they go in there, they absolutely dominate everything and pretty much wipe out Atreides on one night. And then the second one, it's the polar opposite, where now they're looked at as being rather weak. They're not really able to, really do anything. And even though they show this, Fade Rafa, he kind of is a rather underwhelming character, right? Like it's played very well, but his actual conflict with the story is very weak. And really, the only time we see a whole lot of them is at the very, very end, where he kind of fights with Paul one on one. But I honestly did feel like they were relatively, they didn't play as big of a role as I thought they would play. That's just
Yeah,
me personally. Did you kind of share similar?
yeah, I agree, because because the way they got built up in part one, you kind of think, oh well, obviously these two guys have been going at it for centuries, and Paul even mentions this too. He's like, you guys have been fighting for only hundreds of years. We've been fighting for centuries. So you think that there'd be a lot of a lot of vehemence and more involvement of the Harkonnens, but they actually take a backseat role. It's more, I mean, if anything, I mean, if there really is a antagonist, I guess you could sort of say it's Jessica in a way, because
Yes.
she's
Yeah.
because she kind of moves into this role where it's like, you're not really my son. You're just this object now, right? Whereas in part one, you can tell that there is sort of like a concern for the two of them, between the two of them. Here it's like Lady Jessica's like, this is what you have to do, all right, so go do it. And Paul's just like, well, I don't want to do it.
I don't wanna.
Yeah, exactly. And really, really, you think the Harkonnens, were like, oh, so they're just not in the picture anymore, because we only see brief glimpses of them, and we only see them actually come into full view near the end when the Emperor arrives on Arrakis. So so I do want to I do want to shift to the end of the movie where Paul launches this final attack. And can I just say, like, his him taming the sandworms and riding them, there's got to be a meme somewhere called ride the worm out there. Like, that's got to exist, and if not, we should start it.
Yeah, that
Hashtag ride
was
the worm.
yeah, that was such a cool sequence, right? That battle at the end where they kind of like use the nukes, and they use the nukes. I think initially, I know I was like, huh, that was kind of weird how they're using it. Like, I'm not quite sure I understand, but then once I kind of thought about it, I'm like, oh, this goes to just that really excellent strategy, which once again harkens back to the idea, right? That Paul is, he's been studying this place before, and now he's been really living in it. So, all that experience that he's gotten is, made him into this great battle tactician. And obviously, I'm sure having powers to foresee the future probably helps out a lot as well. But I think we kind of see that in full effect, where they kind of shoot off some of these atomic weapons. It destroys part of this kind of mountain that's in the back of the stronghold that the Emperor and House Harkonnen are at. And like with him destroying it, it kind of opens up the floodgates for all of these worms to come through, which I thought was such a cool scene, right? Seeing like multiple worms just coming through there, and obviously the worms just absolutely decimate all the troops on the ground.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was such a cool scene where we see kind of this attack from all sides, and really, I just the whole scene where you see kind of like the Emperor's kind of holed up in this room, and you see Paul enter, and he's just is a man on a mission, right? Like, he has one mind, he has a one-track mind for what he wants to do, and he walks right up to Baron Vladimir there and just kills him. And I love that, right? Like, everyone's just sitting there, like, you don't know what to expect, what he's going to do. But the first thing he does, he just bypasses everything. He walks by guards, he walks by everything, and he just goes there to take care of Baron Vladimir, which I thought was such a cool scene.
Who let's remember, we find out is his grandfather, by the way.
Yes, correct. Yes. Yes, interesting. Once again, how very how much of a factor the Bene Gesserit play with all this is a very interesting way of how they're handling everything. But yeah, so it is just, like I said, such a cool sequence where I think we've all been waiting for that moment, right? The guy that killed his father, and he's finally able to kind of get that retribution, and kind of takes on that moniker, right? Like, he's for the longest time, just kind of, wanted to do this, and then, he's got the ring on, and, he's really taken over the idea that now I am
Usul.
I'm now the Duke, right?
Paul,
I'm now
you
the
are
leader
deep.
of House Atreides, and it's just a great full circle moment. Him
Our
being able to
shared
get that
enemy, the Harkonnens, are
retribution.
once again
But I
in
mean, like,
control of
and I
Arrakis.
mentioned this before. I mean, there's this
Stilgar,
conflict
your
before of
leader,
him trying to decide which
has
role he wants
asked
to
me and my
embrace,
mother to
and
teach
now
you
he's
the
kind of
Mhm.
Girding
embracing
Way
all
to
these
crush
roles.
the
He's a Fremen,
Harkonnens.
but he's also,
We must
the
do more than
Messiah, but he's
this.
also, Duke Paul
We must
Atreides.
totally
So he's
destroy
like all
all spice
three. Like,
production on
I guess you could
Arrakis.
say he's sort of like this sort of Trinity figure,
The
really.
Guild and the
um,
entire
but
universe depends on spice.
what I find so
He
what I
who
find
can
so
destroy
interesting
a
is the
thing
fact that
controls a thing.
once
I will take
he's drunk
100
the
of your
water of
warriors and
life,
train
he
them.
goes all in.
This
He's
100 will
100%,
train the
you know,
thousands that remain.
into the
When the
idea
spice
that
flow
he is
stops,
that person. He is the
all
Lis
eyes will
Al
turn to
Gaib,
Arrakis.
that everyone's spoken of.
The Baron and the Emperor
Because
himself
remember
will
that
be
scene where
forced to
he's in
deal
that
with us.
cavern and he's like talking to all these people. And he tells that one guy about his dead grandmother,
Arrakis
and you're
will
like,
become the
and you're
center
like,
of the
well, this is
universe.
some pretty freaky shit going on here. Like,
Morato,
like he like I don't know if he's like reading his mind
obelisk
or if he's
is
just
of your heart is the
able to
stone.
communicate with like people across space and time or
Kick it.
what, but that's just really uncanny of what he's able to do. But it works to get people on side,
it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, and
Yell at it.
So so at the end of the movie, the Fremen pretty much have decided, we believe in our Messiah. We're gonna embark on this holy war. So it kind of fulfills the dream that Paul had. But even before then, he pretty much says, to the Emperor, you're basically gonna make me your heir, and I'm gonna marry your
Move
daughter, and that's that, right? Do you? Well, this is something that's been bothering me since I watched it. What was that message that Paul sent to the Emperor? Was it like a declaration of war or what? Do you know?
yeah, I don't know if they said it, but I think it was just to come across that Paul was alive, right? I think for the most part it was, and I think there was a very kind of clear threat there because obviously
This is
the
part of
Emperor
the
had kind of
wielding
done this
way
all behind the
that we will
scenes
teach
without
you.
anyone's real knowledge. So the fact that Paul was
Some
alive
thoughts
was a huge issue to
have a
him
certain
because
sound.
if he was to spill the
being
beans about
equivalent
anything,
to
then
a
it's there.
form.
But yeah, I don't
Through
recall
sound
if
and
they
motion,
ever said specifically what was
You
in
will
there.
be able to paralyze
But I
nerves,
think it was enough to get
shatter
obviously the
bones,
Emperor to realize
set
that
fires,
oh no,
suffocate
Paul
an
is really
enemy or
alive,
burst
and
his
that means
organs.
that technically House
We will
Atreides lives
kill
on.
until no
Yeah,
Harkonnen
so-
breathes
and
ever
plus
keen
and
air.
plus they mentioned too that if the other houses would get word of what he did, they would all pretty much go to war against him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think him taking the hand, right, of the Emperor's daughter there, I think was that kind of very clear transition that, he's accepted the role of who he is, right? Because we know he has this very deep relationship with Johnny. We see that throughout the whole thing, right? That's, what he's been building up to. And we see, what a critical role that she plays in this whole thing, including being one of the kind of leaders of, like, when they're doing the battles, like she's leading a group from the west or something. I don't remember what direction, but like she plays a very critical role in this. And we kind of see him, even though he tells her beforehand, like, I'll love you always. But he realizes that in order for him to further his rule, for him to ultimately kind of take that stronger leadership role, that his wedding to this daughter is what's most important. And I think you kind of see him starting to veer more on that path, that what's most important for him is this kind of idea of being this ultimate leader, because like he's able to lead people to this more peaceful time. And unfortunately for him, that means that he has to forfeit some of himself. So I think that was, like I said, probably, I know for some of the people that were with us at the movies, was not something they like to see, kind of seeing Chani almost cast to the side. But I think for, kind of the story and, whether you want to look at it as a good thing or a bad thing, it's Paul kind of giving up that aspect of what he's been about.
Yeah. So what do you think about the ending where the Fremen board those ships and they go off on their holy war? What were your thoughts?
Thought it was, yeah, I mean, I get it. I kind of made the joke at the end, like I don't know if they know how to fly those things. Um, I guess you could make the argument someone else is doing it right. Like I'm sure there
Yeah, yeah,
other people are doing it, but yeah, I mean, super gung ho. So was very, like I said, was interested to see that. But obviously, the whole idea is that it's building up to the Holy War that you'd mentioned, and now that's kind of the start of it. So, kind of interesting how this one ends with kind of this idea of a larger Holy War happening. And also interesting too that like we don't even know if there's a third movie at this stage. Um, so
yeah,
it absolutely feels like it's building up to this, right? And now we have this holy war that's going to happen, and we may or may not ever see the conclusion of that. So, kind of an interesting way for it to end, but it is, staying true with what the source material is, and that's
yeah.
what we
Because I
got.
mean, because I mean, Dennis Villeneuve, has said he's not ruling out the idea of doing a third movie. It
Yes,
would just have
correct.
to,
Yeah.
it would just have to be something that they kind of, I, I guess to paraphrase that could be bigger or outdo what he did in parts 1 and 2.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
Plus, he has the benefit of having the source material, the completed source material, um, that Frank Herbert left behind. So like so if he were to make a third movie, obviously he would pick up at Dune Messiah, but then the question becomes: does he follow Dune to the letter? Because in Dune Messiah, it kind of takes place several years after the Holy War.
Yes.
So we don't
Mhm.
know if really we don't know if Villeneuve is going to adapt Dune Messiah and kind of be faithful to that book, or kind of show us what happened during that Holy War period, um to where Paul is now the emperor of the Imperium. So that remains to be seen, but but even if we don't get another Dune movie from Denis Villeneuve, hopefully there'll be a director out there who kind of steps in and says, "Well, I think I know where to take this."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Or like I said, maybe a good opportunity. Like we're seeing more and more shows being part of it. Is this something where we get kind of this like continuation of maybe the series in a different format? So there's loads of ways that you could take it. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting. I think when you think of kind of the overarching story, it's like almost these things are a prequel to the bigger thing, which is the Holy War, which plays, in the grand scheme of things, a much larger impact on the Dune universe.
right.
But yeah, it's obviously it has enough of a tight knit story to get everything done that it need to get done.
Well,
But I'm sure for people that watched it, going to be interested to see, you want more. And where do you go from here? I'm not too sure.
Well, you know what I'm thinking here, right? Is let's say Denis Villeneuve does make Dune another Dune movie, and it's based, or it's an adaptation of Dune Messiah, right? Obviously, we would have questions of, hey, what happened during the Holy War? Maybe they might do like a mini series, kind of like with what they did with God Monarch, um,
Hmm.
and kind of bridge that gap of what happened between part one and the third, and the third Dune movie, you know.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a possibility right there, because that would fill in the gap, but that would also allow Dennis Villeneuve and his creative team to kind of tell the story their own way, while being faithful to the tone that Frank Herbert set in the Dune universe. So what's your overall score for Dune Part Two?
Yeah, so I would give this 4.5, riding the sandworm, out of 5. I just think that, like I said, it's exactly what you want from a sequel, right? Where the first one did a great job of building the universe, kind of getting us used to all this different terminology and everything. This really helps build up to it because you feel a lot more comfortable with the characters. There's a lot more focus on that. And like I said, we still get kind of the overarching narrative. So I think they did a great job of that. Definitely a strong sequel to follow up a strong first entry.
Yeah, so I would probably give it 4.4 out of 5 sandworms. And and generally there's nothing about Dune Part 2 I didn't like, right? But I did feel like the villainous house of Harkonnen, or villainous house Harkonnen, they could have played a much more proactive role rather than just sitting in the back seat and just taking the blows and really not doing anything, just being these fearsome calculating warriors that you see in part one to these bumbling half wits that you see in part two. Um, I will say they kind of, I sort of feel like they kind of overdid it sometimes with the whole prophecy thing. Because I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to like push the narrative that Paul is supposed to be this long-awaited Messiah for the Fremen. But I felt like if they focus less on that, maybe that might have reduced the runtime of the movie a little bit because because we sort of get the idea already. They've laid the foundation in part one. Lady Jessica kind of you know mentions it every now and then, but I feel like they kind of overdid it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's fair.
but I mean like for the most part, I genuinely felt like the strongest, obviously the strongest character is going to be Paul Atreides, but I think Chani also plays a much more robust role in the movie, and I thought Zendaya did a phenomenal job in that role. And yeah, I think you made the joke too about oh, I hope Spider-Man doesn't find out about this
Yeah, yeah.
because who's she going to choose? Is she going to choose an Avenger or is she going to choose a Duke?
Mm-hmm.
but
Right.
but I also mentioned to you too that 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 Dune Part Two pretty much takes two classical movies and just puts them together, and it melds them together pretty well too, because you've got this romantic freedom fighting aspect of Lawrence of Arabia with this sort of dark cultish atmosphere that you see in Apocalypse Now, right? Um, and in both cases, you could sort of see how this figure goes from this sort of humble, well, Paul's not really from a humble origin because he's Duke, but you know what I mean. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yes, I
he's
know what you mean.
but he goes from this rather humble exile to becoming this exalted leader, and you could sort of make the argument that Paul at the end Paul is sort of relishing in his newfound role as this leader of a cult, right? After resisting for so long, now he's come to the realization that I have to embrace this role. And did you get that vibe from him? Did you kind of feel like he was starting to enjoy being in that role?
Yeah, I think once he got all the powers, I think his mindset became clear, right? Like if you were to see a future where you saw the whole galaxy being happy, right? Just living in peace. Like I think he would fight to just do everything you could to get that. So I think he absolutely leaned into it because I think the powers really helped provide that clarity to him on what he needed to do.
But don't you think like he, even before he drank the water of life, don't you think his visions were, I guess, quote unquote, clear because he did see, what would happen, billions dying in his name in a holy war, and that ends up materializing.
He does say that. I think visually, we just kind of see kind of like the desert stuff. So I won't pass judgment on that because we never really saw. I don't know. At least for me, I didn't really interpret what we were seeing as the Holy War, even though it was stated. I know it was said in the movie like that, but it always just kind of seemed more like, I don't know. It just seemed to deal more with the Fremen than anything else.
Okay, so in other words, it was more local than it was, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I
Okay.
interpret it more like the South was a lot more inhabited than anyone thought, right? And that's how I interpret it, was like her going to the South, she's gonna get the South involved. The South's gonna lead to all this death on Arrakis, not necessarily going out to other places, which is where the story does eventually. That's just how I looked at it, and that's how I interpreted what I was seeing on this one.
Okay, gotcha. Well, that's going to do it for our review of Dune Part 2. Let us know down in the comments below what you think, if you agree with our assessments or if you think we're talking shit. And we promise to do more full reviews. We're both doing very well. We're happy and healthy. Lee, you happy and healthy? You got no bugs lingering in your system?
Hopefully not.
Okay, gotcha. But we'll work to get more reviews out to you guys. But in the meantime, if you're missing us or if you just want to check out more reviews, you can check out our previous episodes and the playlist below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.